Long before anyone called it Istanbul, this city had already lived 1,000 lives. And honestly, it all started with one guy, a Greek explorer named Byzas, who took a gamble on a piece of land around 600 BC and somehow set the stage for one of the most extraordinary cities that has ever existed on this planet. Before he set sail, Byzas consulted an oracle, which was basically the ancient world's version of asking a very cryptic advisor for directions. The oracle told him to build his new city opposite the land of the blind. Confusing advice, obviously, but when Byzas arrived at the Bosphorus and spotted a perfectly good peninsula on the European shore sitting completely empty, while an existing town sat on the supposedly inferior Asian side across the water, he had his answer. Those people over there must have been blind to have chosen the worst spot. So Byzas planted his flag on the better headland, named the place Byzantium after himself, and without having the faintest idea what he was doing, picked one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in all of human history. And it really was a remarkable location. Every single ship traveling between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean had to pass right through the Bosphorus, directly past the city walls. Trade flowed through naturally. Wealth piled up. Byzantium became a prosperous Greek city with temples, markets, and walls thick enough to make most attackers reconsider. Not all of them, of course. The Persians took it. The Spartans and Athenians fought over it. Rome eventually absorbed it because Rome absorbed everything worth keeping. For a while, Byzantium was just another dot on the map of a massive empire. Then in 193 AD, the city made what might be the single worst political decision in its history. During one of Rome's endless civil wars, Byzantium backed the losing side. The winner, Emperor Septimius Severus, was absolutely furious about this. He besieged the city, tore its walls down as punishment, and made it very clear that loyalty to the wrong general had consequences. Then, somewhat reluctantly, he rebuilt it in Roman style, adding forums, bathhouses, and the first version of a chariot racing stadium that would eventually become one of the most famous venues in the ancient world. But none of that compares to what happened in 324 AD, when a man named Constantine won yet another Roman civil war and became the sole ruler of an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. He wanted a new capital. Somewhere fresh, somewhere strategic, somewhere that wasn't burdened by the weight of old Rome's politics and history. He looked east and his eyes landed on Byzantium. Within 6 years, the city had been completely transformed. New walls, grand streets, an enormous imperial palace, an expanded hippodrome where tens of thousands of screaming fans packed in to watch chariot races between the rival blue and green factions. And in 330 AD, Constantine renamed the whole thing after himself, Constantinople, a name the city would carry for the next 1600 years. But Constantine did something even more significant than rename a city. He changed its spiritual identity. He embraced Christianity at a moment when it was still a relatively young and often persecuted faith, and by making Constantinople its eastern stronghold, he launched a process that would transform the city into the religious center of an entire civilization. By the end of the 4th century, Christianity had become the official religion of the empire, and Constantinople had secured its place as the seat of the most powerful bishop in the Eastern world, second in prestige only to the Pope in Rome, and some days not even that. When the western half of the Roman Empire finally collapsed in 476 AD, Constantinople just kept going. The eastern half, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, survived and even flourished. And under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, the city hit what might have been the peak of its entire existence. More than 500,000 people lived within its walls. Greeks, Romans, Armenians, Syrians, merchants, and scholars from 3 continents all living, trading, arguing, and building together. It was the largest city in the world, and it knew it. But then in 532 AD, things fell apart spectacularly. A dispute between chariot racing fan groups, and yes, that is really what started it, spiraled into a full-scale urban uprising. The city burned for days. Around 30,000 people died. Half of Constantinople was reduced to ash and rubble, including the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, which was completely destroyed. Justinian could have collapsed under the weight of it. Instead, he did the opposite. He rebuilt Hagia Sophia from scratch, and what he built was so extraordinary that it genuinely changed the history of architecture. The new cathedral, completed in 537 AD, had a dome so large and so perfectly engineered that it seemed to float above the interior as if held up by light rather than stone. Its walls were covered in gold mosaics. Its floors were polished marble. People who walked inside for the first time reportedly stood in silence, unable to process what they were seeing. For nearly 1,000 years, it remained the largest cathedral on earth. He also built an enormous underground water cistern beneath the city, supported by hundreds of ancient columns, some of them carved with Medusa heads just sitting there at the base in the dark. It is still there today, and it is still one of the strangest and most beautiful things you will ever walk through. Constantinople at this point was not just a political capital. It was the place where the ancient world's knowledge was preserved, where global trade routes converged, where art and scholarship and religious debate all happened at the highest possible level. It was, in the truest sense, the center of the world. Of course, that kind of status attracts enemies. From the 7th century onward, Arab armies who had swept through Syria, Egypt, and North Africa at breathtaking speed turned their attention toward Constantinople. They besieged it twice, in 674 and again in 717. Both times they failed, partly because the Byzantines had a weapon so terrifying that it genuinely seems like something from a fantasy story. Greek fire, a flammable liquid that burned on water, that no amount of sand or water could extinguish, pumped from shipboard tubes onto enemy vessels with devastating effect. The formula has never been fully recovered. Nobody today knows exactly what it was made of. All we know is that it worked, and that it saved Constantinople when almost nothing else could have. Internally though, the city was also fighting itself over religion in a way that seems almost bewildering from the outside. For over a century, Byzantine society was torn apart by what is called the iconoclast controversy. Certain emperors, starting with Leo III in 726, decided that the veneration of religious images was a form of idolatry and ordered sacred icons, mosaics, and paintings destroyed across the empire. This was not a minor theological argument. It divided families, split the church, and led to actual violence in the streets of Constantinople. The debate was finally resolved in 843 when the use of icons was officially restored, an event still celebrated in Orthodox Christianity as the triumph of orthodoxy. The 9th and 10th centuries brought a second flourishing. Trade expanded dramatically. Vikings and Rus traders from Scandinavia and what is now Russia and Ukraine began traveling down river routes to the Black Sea, arriving at Constantinople with furs, amber, and slaves, and leaving with silk, wine, and gold coins. The Norse called the city Miklagar, simply the Great City, because nothing else in their experience came close to it. Out of these connections came one of history's more unusual arrangements, the Varangian Guard, a regiment of enormous axe-carrying Norse and later Anglo-Saxon warriors who served as the Byzantine emperor's personal bodyguard. Imagine walking the streets of 10th century Constantinople and encountering a 6-foot-tall Viking standing at the palace gate. That was a real thing that happened. But beneath all this vitality, something was quietly going wrong. In 1054, the Christian church split in two. The Western Catholic Church based in Rome and the Eastern Orthodox Church based in Constantinople formally excommunicated each other over theological disputes that had been brewing for generations. At the time it probably felt like a religious administrative argument. In hindsight it was one of the most consequential events in medieval history, because that split would eventually create the conditions for the unthinkable. After a catastrophic military defeat against the Seljuk Turks in 1071, the Byzantine Empire found itself dangerously weakened and in desperate need of military help. The emperor appealed to Western Europe. What came instead were the Crusades, wave after wave of Latin Christian armies marching through Constantinople on their way to the Holy Land. The relationship started awkward, became tense, and then in 1204 produced one of the most shocking betrayals in history. The Fourth Crusade, nominally aimed at recapturing Jerusalem, was redirected toward Constantinople instead, largely through Venetian political maneuvering. Christian soldiers sacked the greatest Christian city in the world. For 3 days they looted, burned, and killed without restraint. They stripped the Hagia Sophia. They murdered civilians. They melted down ancient bronze sculptures for coin. The famous bronze horses from the Hippodrome were shipped to Venice, where they still sit above the entrance to St. Mark's Basilica to this day, a 900-year-old reminder of what happened. Constantinople, after standing for nearly 9 centuries as the crown of Eastern civilization, was left in ruins by the people who were supposed to share its faith. The Byzantines recaptured their city in 1261 but returned to something heartbreaking. A city that had once housed 500,000 people now held perhaps 50,000. Fields grew inside the ancient walls where neighborhoods had been. The empire patched itself back together across the 13th and 14th centuries, but the momentum was gone. By the mid-1400s, the once vast Byzantine Empire had been reduced to essentially just the city itself, a small Christian island surrounded on every side by the Ottoman Turks. In 1453, the end came. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, 21 years old and burning with ambition, assembled an army of over 100,000 men and pointed it at Constantinople's walls. Inside, Emperor Constantine XI had maybe 7,000 defenders. The numbers were almost insulting. The siege lasted 7 weeks. Enormous cannons, the most advanced artillery in the world at that moment, hammered the ancient walls day and night. On the 29th of May, the walls finally gave way. Constantine reportedly stripped off his imperial robes and died fighting as an ordinary soldier in the chaos. With him died the Byzantine Empire. After 1100 years of continuous history, Mehmed rode into the city and went straight to the Hagia Sophia. He ordered it converted to a mosque immediately. A new era had begun. What Mehmed did next reveals a great deal about the kind of ruler he was. Rather than leaving the city half empty and broken, he actively rebuilt it and refilled it. He brought in Muslims, Christians, and Jews from across his empire, assigned them neighborhoods, and told them to get on with life. The population rebounded remarkably fast. He built Topkapi Palace on the old Byzantine Acropolis, not as one grand building in the European style but as a rambling complex of courtyards and gardens with views over the water that made every other palace in the world look like it was trying too hard. He founded the Grand Bazaar, which would eventually become one of the largest covered markets on earth. He let the Greek Orthodox Church keep operating. He welcomed Jewish refugees, especially after 1492 when Spain expelled its Jewish community and thousands of Sephardic Jews came looking for somewhere safe to land. Istanbul, as it was increasingly being called, remained a genuinely multi-ethnic, multi-faith city even under Muslim Ottoman rule. The 16th century under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent was the city's Ottoman golden age. Istanbul had grown to somewhere between 600,000 and 700,000 people. The architect Mimar Sinan, who had started his career as a military engineer before discovering what he was really talented at, designed hundreds of buildings across the empire during this period. His masterpiece was the Suleimani Mosque complex, completed in 1557, a cascade of domes and half-domes rising from the city's third hill that managed to feel both overwhelming and perfectly calm at the same time. Not long after, Sultan Ahmed I added the Blue Mosque nearby, with its 6 minarets and its interior walls covered in over 20,000 hand-painted ceramic tiles. The skyline that Istanbul is famous for today was essentially created in the span of about 60 years. The streets of Ottoman Istanbul were something else entirely. Turkish officials, Persian scholars, Greek merchants, Armenian jewelers, Venetian diplomats, Arab traders, dervish mystics, and laborers from every corner of the empire all lived in the same city, spoke dozens of languages, and somehow made it work. Coffee arrived from Arabia in the 16th century and immediately took over. Coffee houses opened everywhere, becoming the places where people went to talk, argue about politics, listen to poetry, and drink this remarkable new substance that kept you awake and made everything feel more interesting. But empires decline, and the Ottoman one was no different. By the late 17th century, military reverses had started to slow the empire's expansion. By the 18th century, European observers were already calling it the Sigmund of Europe, which is the kind of nickname that is hard to shake. Reform efforts in the 19th century brought European-style buildings, foreign banks, and new institutions to Istanbul. In 1856, Sultan Abdülmecid actually moved out of Topkapi Palace and into the newly built Dolmabahce Palace on the Bosphorus waterfront, a spectacular building with crystal chandeliers and marble staircases that looked like someone had tried to build Versailles on a waterfront in Turkey, which is essentially exactly what had happened. In 1875, the city opened a short underground funicular railway called the Tunnel, making Istanbul only the second city in the world after London to have a subway, which feels like a detail that should be better known. The 20th century arrived in a rush of catastrophe. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 forced constitutional reform. Then came the First World War, which the Ottomans entered on the German side and lost badly. By November 1918, British, French, Italian, and Greek soldiers were occupying Istanbul's streets. Warships sat in the Bosphorus. The once supreme Ottoman government was humiliated, and foreign powers were drawing up plans to carve up whatever was left of the empire, potentially including the city itself. But out of that occupation, something new was growing. Mustafa Kemal, a military officer who had become a hero at Gallipoli, gathered nationalist forces across Anatolia and fought a war of independence that eventually drove every occupying army out. In 1923, the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed. The Ottoman Sultanate was abolished. The last sultan slipped out of Istanbul on a British warship, ending a dynasty that had lasted over 600 years. And then Mustafa Kemal, now known as Ataturk, made a decision that genuinely stunned the city. He moved the capital to Ankara. For the first time since Constantine had chosen this peninsula 16 centuries earlier, Istanbul was not the center of power. The city contracted. Much of its non-Turkish population left or was pressured to leave under the wave of nationalist policies that followed. The cosmopolitan mixing of peoples that had defined Istanbul for centuries faded considerably. In 1930, the name Constantinople was officially retired and Istanbul became the city's only legal name, derived from an old Greek phrase that had simply meant to the city, used so often by ordinary people getting on boats that it eventually replaced everything else. Under Ataturk's modernization drive, Istanbul was physically remade. Old neighborhoods were demolished for wide boulevards. Taksim Square became the symbol of the modern secular city. The Arabic script used for Turkish was replaced overnight with a Latin alphabet. Women were given civil rights. The fez was banned. Religious courts were shut down. The city was being reinvented in real time, shedding its Ottoman identity in favor of something deliberately, aggressively modern. Then from the 1960s onward, Istanbul exploded in size. Rural migrants from across Anatolia poured into the city looking for work in its factories and workshops. The population went from about 1.5 million in 1960 to over 10 million by the year 2000. Entire districts grew up almost overnight on hillsides that had been farmland just years before. The first Bosphorus bridge opened in 1973, physically joining the European and Asian sides of the city by road for the very first time. Skyscrapers rose in the northern business districts. Istanbul became Turkey's economic engine, its cultural capital, its media center, its everything, even as Ankara remained the political one. Today more than 15 million people call Istanbul home. You can stand in a 6th century Byzantine church, walk 10 minutes to an Ottoman mosque, eat lunch in a market that has been selling spices for 500 years, and watch a container ship pass between two continents, all before dinner. The city has been Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Crusader, Ottoman, and Turkish. It has been conquered, burned, rebuilt, sacked, abandoned, and reinvented so many times that its history reads less like a city's biography and more like the entire story of Western civilization compressed into one peninsula. Byzas picked a good spot. He just had absolutely no idea what he was starting.